Welcome to another STARS webinar. I am David Earn, Director of Programs and Communication at STARS. For those of you who are here for the first time, STARS webinars are interactive discussions about future-oriented topics such as leadership, geopolitics, technology, climate change, and health. 100 participants are attending today's webinar live, and hundreds more watch it later on as a recording. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Today we talk with John Allen about how to stop AI warfare before it starts. John assumed the presidency of the Brookings Institution in 2017. He is a retired US Marine Corps four-star general and former commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force and US forces in Afghanistan. In the latter role, he commanded 150,000 US and NATO forces in Afghanistan from 2011 to 2013. Before retiring from public service, John also served for 15 months as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense on Middle East security, as well as President Obama's special presidential envoy to the Global Coalition to Counter ISIL. He is also the co-author of the book Turning Point, Policymaking in the Era of Artificial Intelligence, which was published last year and which sets the scene for today's discussion. Good morning to you, John, and thank you very much for speaking in today's webinar.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and I hold the book up, not because I'll ever make a penny off of it, but because it is available now. And it's actually provides a useful primer on thinking about AI and policy. It's good to see you, David. It's good to be with you.
After the product placement, we have 30 minutes to discuss with John. I will take the privilege to ask the first couple of questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions for John, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. Today's session is entitled How to Stop AI Warfare Before It Starts. So to get us started, can you describe for us what exactly AI-powered warfare entails, and what does that future of hyperwar look like?
Sure. Well, again, it's great to be back with the STARS team and to have the opportunity to speak to such a broad audience. And wherever you are on the planet today, I wish you a good day and good health. Throughout all of human history, warfare has often and most frequently been determined by the side that could decide more quickly, could adapt to the operational environment more readily, and could apply combat power more precisely than the other side. That's always been the competition in the realm of conflict. Speed. What artificial intelligence does in this world that we're facing today is it provides a capacity through automating certain of those functions traditionally appearing in combat, automating certain of those functions to increase the speed. And so as time goes on, as we see artificial intelligence or artificially intelligent systems coming into line, we will see that the speed of conflict will begin to accelerate a lot. And that then carries with it the conversation, carries with it the very difficult conversation about where is the human in the process of deciding on the application of combat power, which of course has the potential to be both lethal in the human sense, but also highly destructive in the context of infrastructure. So artificial intelligence, David, has the capacity to vastly speed up conflict. And then we're faced with the reality of where the human is in this process. And that's what we're facing. And the faster it goes, the more it begins to appear in the realm of what we call hyperwar, which is warfare conducted at such a speed that perhaps the human is removed from the loop. And we're all quite concerned about the reality of that.
How real and how far away is this threat? And in particular, which countries and maybe technologies worry you the most?
Well, it's a great question. My sense is we could begin to see certain of the realities of hyperwar within the next 10 years. We're already seeing artificial intelligence appearing in militaries of some of the more technologically advanced states, nations that have the capacity through supercomputing and computer science of designing algorithms which can be trained on big data to begin to have a role in the process of warfare. For today, in a number of states, the United States, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, Germany to some extent, NATO broadly, but not NATO as an entity yet. We're beginning to see exploration of how artificially intelligent systems can provide that acceleration in warfare. Now, I have to be very clear in saying that we have AI at work right now in the US military, but there's a big difference between artificial intelligence that may be assisting and speeding up the process of intelligence analysis and artificial intelligence that has been applied to lethal systems that are attacking individuals in the battle space. That's a very different conversation. So we're already seeing artificial intelligence appear in the militaries of certain countries in the world. The question about whether we see a, if you will, a unified artificially intelligent battle space system that ultimately from the decision to the application of precise fires is done in an automated way or an autonomous way, we're a few years from that. But portions of that are already appearing to be automated and autonomous with artificial intelligence.
So knowing the reality of potential AI warfare, let's return to the title question of what can be done about it. Sure. For instance, how should the boundaries of off-limits areas be defined?
Well, it's really a very important question. And for those who are on the webinar today, who will, through STARS, seek to understand their leadership role going forward in the world, this is a really important question. And in the past, nations have come together, leaders have come together to have the conversations about limiting the destructiveness of certain kinds of weapon systems. And we've had a mixed success in that process, but nonetheless, my own view, and I've fought in 4 conflicts, my own view is we should do everything we can. Right now, before AI is embedded in virtually every aspect of going to war, we should be doing everything we can right now to have the conversation about how we limit the potential autonomous destructiveness of artificially intelligent systems. Now that's complicated now, in particular between the United States and China, because the relationship between the two countries has deteriorated so badly over the last 4 years, but it was not just the last 4 years, but over the last 4 years, and we're not off to a great start with the new US administration. But even during the worst years of the Cold War, the United States could still speak with the Soviet Union to have constructive conversations about arms limitations. So we have to burn through, I think, some of the difficult relationships that we're facing right now with Russia and China. And I'm not going to get into the politics of who's at fault here. I'm just saying the relationships, the reality is the relationships are not good. And we have to recognize that there are certain aspects of the future of conflict which could lead us directly into a hyperwar environment where we should start to think right now about how we can limit the behaviors and the employment options of artificial intelligence. And we can do so geographically, we can do so against certain types of targets. We can do so in compliance with the rule of law, the law of armed conflict, which is an international treaty. And we can do so in the context of where it might be applied in command and control. For example, it worries me a lot about nuclear capable states that embed artificially intelligent command and control systems that might make an autonomous decision to launch a nuclear system. So we've got a lot of work to do and a lot of conversation to have as we go forward. And while we are all moving forward embedding artificially intelligent systems into the spectrum of military capabilities. It's over here on this end where people start getting killed and infrastructure starts to be destroyed, where we've got to have the conversation relatively soon about how we can voluntarily, as a community of nations, begin to limit the effects.
If we take this a step further, how might the international community regulate such weapons? I mean, is the negotiation of a global AI treaty a realistic scenario, or where is action needed most urgently?
Well, it's a very important question. I think we would all want to see some kind of a treaty that could limit the application of artificial intelligence, primarily in the context of lethal systems, systems that can ultimately foster significant destruction. Whether we'll get a treaty or not, it's hard to say. If you have been following the conversations by both scientists and humanitarian activists on how we as a community of nations might voluntarily limit the introduction of artificial intelligence into our warfighting systems, it's really, once again, it's a mixed response. Many countries will say they do want to engage in this conversation and would probably want to have a treaty, like we've had a treaty on landmines, like we've had a treaty on poison gas, like we've had treaties on other military capabilities, which sadly didn't result from the front end of the conversation before the systems were fielded. The conversation occurred after the horrific effects of those systems, so that we were coming at this from a position of trauma rather than a position of prevention. So my hope would be that we could all see into the future the potential of what hyperwar could bring to us in terms of destructiveness, and begin to have the conversation about voluntarily limiting the application of certain AI capabilities in the lethal autonomous systems that we should. Now, we may not get everybody to sign up. Some countries, mine, which has not signed up to some of these kinds of treaties, has still voluntarily complied with the provisions without signing up to the treaty. Treaties, as you know, and certainly in my country, it's a very political issue. It has to pass through our Congress. So we'll actually comply with the provisions of treaties without ever signing on to them. But that's a bit of a fragility that I think that many people don't like to see. So your question is really important. We should be leaning forward hard right now before countries invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the autonomous lethal systems that could emerge, and have the conversation about how we can voluntarily begin to think about limiting the applications.
In that spirit, do you also think it is possible to encourage restraint, to restrict the abuse of AI data for military purposes? Sure,
the United States does now. And I don't take a position vis-a-vis any other country. I'll just tell you what we're doing. We take a very serious ethical obligation to restrain the employment of artificial intelligence. For example, and I get phone calls about this from all around the world from other leaders who ask me how I would think about this in combat, but also think about this as someone who's observing artificial intelligence. The law of armed conflict, which applied specifically to the wars in which I have fought, but also applied to many of the countries that were in the coalitions that I've commanded, says that a commander that contemplates the use of force in combat must comply with 3 stipulations by international law. This is not something that's just voluntary, it's by international law. First, the necessity to use force. Second, when force is applied, by law, commanders must be able to, what they call, discriminate, be able to tell who the combatants are, the soldiers that you intend to apply force against, and the innocent civilians or the restricted infrastructure that shouldn't be attacked. So necessity, discrimination, and very importantly, proportionality, using just enough force to accomplish the mission. Now, as a commander, in the future, even with autonomous systems operating in my battle space that belong to me, that are autonomous, I give up no responsibility for the application of combat power from an autonomous system. I'm still responsible in the event that someone is inadvertently killed or injured or infrastructure is destroyed. So there is an example of the voluntary compliance with international law to ensure that AI-powered, AI-enabled lethal systems are not just launched off into the battle space to run amok. That's our concern, that while we will always be constrained by international law, and I held a lot of my people accountable for not complying with international law in combat, our concerns are there may be other countries in the world that are not so committed to the restraint or the constraint that comes with the voluntary compliance with international law. And you can imagine what it's like in the battle space to suddenly be confronted with a swarm of systems that's using facial recognition through computer vision and machine learning and operating completely autonomous from a commander, an opposing commander who has no intention to limit the outcome in terms of destructiveness, what that would be like, the terror it could inflict on a civilian population. So absent a treaty, absent voluntary restraint and in compliance with international law, this is something that we should all be quite concerned about as we embark deeper into the 21st century and the realities that we may face with hyperwar.
I'd like to take a question from the audience that just ties into what you said. Sure. The question comes from STARS alumnus Tobias Vanchura. He's asking, how expensive is AI tech for military applications as compared to the cost of nuclear weapons? For instance, with AI proliferating in many fields, will it become more readily available for more nations than nuclear weapons in the past, and therefore also available for military applications?
Sure. It's a great question. AI is quite the bargain in the big scheme of things in terms of a nuclear arsenal. And it doesn't require a nation, doesn't require a rich nation to both acquire AI capabilities and to employ them in their systems. And again, our fear as we go forward isn't that just a few states, just as we have today, a few states are nuclear capable. Our concern is the proliferation of AI-empowered weapon systems that would, under certain conditions, with certain states, be restrained. Certain countries producing an AI-powered system and then selling it, proliferating it into other countries' arsenals. And we should be very concerned about that. AI is not, of course, it can be quite destructive, especially if it's tied to nuclear command and control in the context of an early release of a weapons system that it has decided unilaterally to launch because it has, through the analysis of all data available to it through its supercomputing capabilities, it has decided if it doesn't launch right now, it will never get its birds off the pad. That's a terrifying reality. And for those of you who've ever taken the time, you might want to watch the movie Failsafe back in the 60s, where in fact the AI-powered nuclear command and control system malfunctioned and the United States and the Soviet Union went eyeball to eyeball in a nuclear conflict. That's the high-end problem, but those are for states that have highly sophisticated technological capabilities and nuclear arsenals. But there are many states that will be able to afford lethal autonomous systems, but not be constrained by virtue of their heritage or their background or their particular political dogma, not be constrained in how they apply them in the battle space. And we should be very conscious of that. It is much cheaper to have artificially intelligent systems capable of autonomous employment than it is to have nuclear arsenals.
Let's take the next question from Salman Bokhari. He's the managing director of CIDAPEX. He's asking, will space be the next frontier of AI hyper warfare? Sure,
it is now. And I'm not, I just didn't bust a huge classification threshold. AI is going to be essential for space missions in the future, whether it's orbital operations, or deep space operations. AI is going to be critically important. And if you've been watching what's been happening with the US and Perseverance on the Martian surface, when the time of transmission, just by the speed of light, takes 7 minutes to get from Earth to Mars, to tell a helicopter to take off and fly a profile, we have to rely on artificial intelligence for those kinds of remote, long-range sensor systems for us to have the kind of scientific return that we want. So you'll see more and more presence of artificially intelligent systems on our sensor systems going forward. And it will certainly be a part of our orbital portfolio as time goes on as well.
We have a tricky question from Tony Reis. He's the former CEO of Swisscom. I'm going to ask you anyway. He's writing, when you consider the way the Chinese have treated the corona pandemic with the WHO, do you believe that they would adhere to an international AI agreement?
That's a very important question. You'll have to ask the Chinese. I have led an American delegation in a bilateral conversation with Chinese colleagues on this very issue. First, how we view artificial intelligence, just as a science. Then how we would see potentially artificial intelligence appearing in our, as I've said before, the spectrum of military capabilities broadly. And then we began to narrow that down into our views on artificial intelligence, from everything from a autonomous swarm to nuclear command and control. And I will report happily that in very broad measures, and there aren't any Chinese generals or American generals, I'm retired, but there's no Chinese generals or American generals sitting in these conversations. They're track two. But I'm very happy that we see the world very similarly in the terms of the potential for AI. Broadly, the potential that will be good for all humankind on AI, everything from healthcare and so on. But we began to not see eye to eye on the issues associated with the specific applications of AI in autonomous systems, and we can't have some conversations at all. So I don't sit here and say that I believe one way or the other how the Chinese may feel, but absent certainty in that regard, the United States is going to have to, as we will with our allies, we'll have to be able to take certain measures to defend ourselves and potentially take certain measures to create the appearance and the reality of deterrence as we go forward. Now, deterrence used to be measured in many respects by nuclear arsenals and the capacity to launch, whether it's from a bomber or from a ground-based system or a sea launch system. But that redundancy made it so ominous, if you will, for opponents that it created deterrence. Deterring AI-capable systems and countries from using AI-capable systems is much more difficult. So we're going to have to prepare to defend ourselves. And that, of course, creates the potential appearance of an AI arms race. And none of us want to go there, but we may be facing that.
Speaking about preparing to defend ourselves, we have a specific question about the Swiss Army, if you don't mind. The question comes from Peter Wirdl. He's the founder and CEO of Waypoint Business Navigation. Mm-hmm. He's asking you, what would you recommend the Swiss Army for the development of future defense capabilities?
Well, I would suggest a 1-month trip by me to Switzerland to give you an in-depth response. One of the great places in the world that I've visited. Look, apart from the whole conversation about lethality, AI has enormous capacity. I don't think that's necessarily your question, but AI has enormous capacity to speed up the process of intelligence collection and intelligence analysis. AI has the capacity to speed up the process of decision support or decision assistance. AI has the capacity through autonomous drone systems, whether they are aerial drones or terrestrial drones, to create substantial capabilities for surveillance. And it makes that much easier because those systems can be quite precise. Those systems can operate on their own. They can operate they can be geo-fenced. So you just launch the system out into an area, and the artificial intelligence using GPS knows that it never leaves a particular area, but is constantly watching a border or a particularly vulnerable avenue of approach into the country. So there's a lot of work that can be done in surveillance, a lot of work that can be done on command and control, a lot of work that can be done on intelligence analysis, and an area where AI is beginning to have a lot of effect for all militaries is in maintenance and sustainability. The capacity now through artificial intelligence, through big data analytics, to monitor dynamic systems in airplanes or on ships. Switzerland doesn't have a big navy, but to monitor dynamic systems and in ways we could never before detect anomalies early, which in the past, you detected the anomaly when the system tore itself to shreds because it was a dynamic system and a generator or something like that. We now have the capacity, not just of that early detection through anomalous analysis, but the system has the capacity to tell the maintainer to go to this page of this manual. It'll take you this long and you'll need these parts. That's a sophistication that keeps a military efficient. It keeps it effective. It keeps it safe. And we're beginning to see AI really deluge into militaries around the world today, just in maintenance and sustainability alone.
Even if militaries are responsible with AI, since AI technology is fairly prone to proliferation, it may end up in the hands of hackers and non-state actors. How big is that risk? It
is a risk. You won't be surprised to learn that AI is also helpful in defending against malevolent forces in cyberspace. There will be folks that are listening today to us talking who probably are deeply engaged in cybersecurity. And we know that zero-day threats are a real problem. And what we have seen are cognitive, so they're AI, they're thinking, cognitive, they're thinking endpoint defensive systems in cyberspace that have been trained over and over and over again on the DNA signatures of certain codes of malware, have the capacity, because they're cognitive, they sit outside the network. As the malware comes into the network, it may never have seen that particular piece of malware, but it has seen the DNA in the code and can stop it. So it should not be a surprise to those individuals that while artificial intelligence can enhance cyber hacking, can enhance the capacity for vulnerability in the cyber sphere, just as it enhances vulnerability, it can also enhance defense.
We are already running out of time, but to wrap up the webinar, I'd like to zoom out again and look at the big picture. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has repeatedly stated that the US will compete, collaborate, and confront China as needed. What gives you hope that in the field of global AI governance, the US and China can and will cooperate?
Well, you know, there are those who talk about the US and China being in a Cold War, and I think that's just wrong. It just is. The Cold War was an awful moment of geostrategic existential threat backed up by massive thermonuclear arsenals. And we're nowhere near that with China. We have some very major disagreements with China over a lot of things, from humanitarian issues all the way to major economic matters. But there are opportunities, I think, if we are wise and we think about the future of the 21st century, where there will be opportunities for the United States and China to find ways to cooperate and collaborate, one of the other streams of diplomacy that I lead right now is how the United States and China can collaborate on the COVAX. How the United States and China can perhaps help each other and the world prepare to prevent the next pandemic. Now, that's a little bit difficult given where this one started, but we should be thinking in those terms. How we might be working very closely together on climate. If there was ever one topic where advanced artificial intelligence through supercomputing could help us to really begin to deal with the issues of climatological degradation, here is where the United States and China can find collaboration. So collaborate or cooperate, we should look for those. And we should be prepared to compete. I mean, we're the two greatest economies on the planet. Our economies are different, but the economies are technologically pretty advanced. So that means there will be competition. Now, if we're smart, let's find a way for competition to be opportunity. But if not, competition can lead then to the next thing, which is confrontation. And so when Tony Blinken says, let's find a way to cooperate, let's find a way to compete, but we may also have to confront, I think that's the reality of the world that we face today. My hope is that diplomacy and the genuine desire for the U.S.-China relationship to be good for both our respective countries' peoples, but even more broadly, good for the peoples in the world. My hope is that we'll spend more time seeking to cooperate, collaborate, and usefully compete than it will be find ourselves in a great geostrategic competition where in the end, AI-based weapon systems and thermonuclear arsenals are the basis for power. That's a losing proposition. We got too much we can gain in the 21st century and an awful lot to lose if we're not careful.
At previous STAR Symposia, you have spoken powerfully about the need for values-driven leadership, both in the US and abroad. How does this perspective inform your thinking on AI and other emerging technologies?
Sure. Looking out my window at a bright, sunny Virginia morning. Look, all of these technologies are values neutral. It is the values of the people themselves. It is the values of the countries themselves that ultimately define the usefulness of these technologies. And so if these technologies can be applied in education to give our children a chance, when many, in my country in particular, are communities of color that have been disenfranchised from the mainstream of the American dream, when AI can be brought into their homes and into their classrooms, that will make the world better. When AI can be used to prevent the next pandemic, when AI can be used to deal with the issues associated with climate, that gives me hope. That's a values-based application for the good of artificial intelligence. But there are some countries that will use AI for the suppression of the population. There were some countries that will use AI for the surveillance of the population. There will be some countries that will use AI in an unconstrained manner to create autonomous weapon systems that will ultimately bring death and havoc to populations. Let me just read the dedication from my book. Again, I'm not trying to sell a thing. But the book we just wrote was dedicated to our youth. I think I'm talking to some today. Into whose hands we have placed the full potential of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. It is our most fervent prayer that the youth are guided by the light of good in wielding these technologies for the benefit of all humanity. So in the end, these technologies are values neutral. They only become good or they only become bad by the values of the people that develop them and ultimately apply them.
With that, I would like to thank you very much, John, for your time and for sharing your insights with us. Thank you, John.
Always good to be with you, and I wish you the best. I wish everyone the best who tuned in today. Good health.
I'd also like to thank all our alumni who participated in today's session. I hope to see you again in the next STARS webinar. In the meantime, take care and stay healthy. Thank you and goodbye.